Today's story is yet another ghost tale about a man who comes back to Earth with his eyes on another man's property. But as with so many of these stories, the ending probably will not be what you expect. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to yet another classical Japanese folktale. If you like Japanese history and culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel because there are still plenty more stories where this one came from. And with all of that out of the way, let's just get into the story. Once upon a time, imawa mukashi, there was a man by the name of Saeki no Kimiyuki, who was formerly the governor of the province of Harima. He himself had a son whose name was lost to history but was known throughout the capital by the title of Sadaifu. What that title actually means, I'm not exactly sure, but this Sadaifu lived at the intersection of Shijo Avenue and Takakura Street. He himself was the father of a man named Akimune, who was apparently still living when these stories were written down and compiled. Now, of these three men, the one most important to our story and the only one that you actually need to know is the only one whose name is missing, aka the Sadaifu. At one point, this Sadaifu guy was a retainer of a man named Fujiwara no Sadanari, who had just been appointed as the new governor of the province of Awa. Of course, this meant that the Sadaifu would follow his lord out of the capital and into Awa province, along with a whole travel party of people because you weren't going to travel alone, especially not a brand newly appointed governor. But it just so happened that along the way, while they were sailing across the sea, something happened to their ship and they, along with their whole travel party, were thrown into the ocean and unceremoniously drowned in its depths. Now, this Sadaifu guy had a relative of some sort, though the text doesn't specifically mention or specify what kind of relative it is. And this relative was a man known as the Kawachi no Zenji. This is the second name that you actually need to remember for this story. The rest are basically just there to add context for the people who are interested in that sort of thing, which would probably have included most of the people living at the time. Now, we can probably assume, although we can't be completely sure, that given this man's name, Kawachi no Zenji, which literally means something like the priest of Kawachi, this man, Kawachi no Zenji, lived in the province of Kawachi. Now, the most pertinent fact to our story is that this Kawachi no Zenji had an amber-spotted ox that was used to pull his carriage whenever he went traveling, because even if he was a Buddhist priest who had ostensibly sworn off all worldly luxuries, he was still a member of the upper classes of society. And if history has taught us anything, it's that Buddhist vows were pretty flexible in practice, if not in theory. But the Kawachi no Zenji had a friend of his that, for whatever reason, one day, needed an ox to pull his own carriage. And being the magnanimous servant of the Buddha that he was, the Kawachi no Zenji promptly lent his ox to this friend. Who this friend was, we don't know, but at some point, that very same friend sent one of his own carriages to a place called Yodomi, a word which literally just means something like a spot where the river comes very close to a standstill. And according to one of my sources, there was actually a river near the capital called Yodomi River, and I'm assuming that wherever this Yodomi place was, it was near this river with the same name. Regardless of where this place was specifically, we do know one thing about it. It was on the other side of this river, which meant that the driver, who had hitched up the carriage to this borrowed ox that they had borrowed from the Kawachi no Zenji, and the driver determined that he needed to cross this bridge, obviously. And he determined that the best place for crossing was a bridge called Hizume Bridge. Now, there wasn't anything special about this bridge. It wasn't like it was the Bridge of Agi, which was haunted, nor was it falling apart or run down or anything like that. It was just a normal bridge. So this driver, who was not riding on the carriage, but running alongside it as the carriage drivers did at the time, making sure that the ox was going along the path that it needed to go down, he drove this carriage right across the bridge without a single care in the world. Both he and the ox just nonchalantly going along their way with this carriage behind the ox. But as the carriage was making its way across the bridge, the driver, who was apparently not paying attention because again, what was there to be worried about? It was just a normal bridge. But he accidentally guided this ox, just nonchalantly not paying attention, in such a way that one of the back wheels suddenly slipped off of the side of the bridge. Now, this sudden shift in weight happened so fast that the driver didn't notice in time until it was far too late, and he couldn't do anything to rectify it. The only thing he could do was stand there wide-eyed and watch as the carriage started slipping over the edge, dragging everything attached along with it, faster and faster, picking up more and more speed. The more carriage that made it over the side, the faster it just started pulling everything along with it, including this borrowed ox. In a matter of seconds, the entire carriage had made it over the edge of the bridge, and it looked like the ox was doomed to follow, falling to its inevitable death at the bottom. But suddenly, almost looking like it understood the situation and determined that it was not going to die here, the ox dug in its feet into the bridge, flexed its massive frame, and pushed off of the floor. This stopped the falling carriage, which was now dangling there helplessly in the air, dead in its tracks. A second later, the harness around the ox, under the weight of the whole carriage that was hanging off of it, just snapped, and the carriage went tumbling into the shallow waters below, throwing up a noisy splash as it did so, and breaking into 1,000 pieces on the rocks. The ox, meanwhile, was just left standing there atop this bridge, its head held high, almost like it was proud of itself. The good news was that no one had been in the carriage when it fell, and the only thing that was lost was a carriage, and not a life, human or ox. Which, I mean, losing a carriage wasn't great, to be sure, but things were certainly not as bad as they could have been. I mean, it's possible that the driver could have gotten caught up in this. It's possible, in fact, it would have been expected that the ox would go down with it, and yet the ox, miraculously, by sheer force, managed to not go down with the carriage. The driver, of course, was completely dumbfounded, just awestruck. He had just watched a single ox hold an entire carriage over a bridge in order to save itself. And yet, after a brief moment of looking like it was ready to conquer the world, it immediately switched back into its regular, dopey-looking ox self. Just going along like nothing had ever happened. No big deal. I just basically bench pressed several hundreds of pounds. No problem. As sturdy and strong as oxen can be, this one was clearly on a different level. If it had been any other ox, it would likely be lying in a broken heap at the bottom of the bridge amid the wreckage of this carriage. But here it was, completely fine and ready to move on like nothing had happened. The driver, with, nothing really left to do, just got the ox, turned it around, and brought it back to the Kawachi no Zenji's place. Or rather, it wasn't the Kawachi no Zenji's place, it was the Kawachi no Zenji's friend's place, right? Of course, when he showed up, he had to explain in full why there was no more carriage and why he hadn't done whatever he was originally sent out to do. But he explained the situation with such amazed gusto because, guys, you wouldn't believe what just happened. This ox is flippin' amazing. It just saved itself. This was crazy. Now, I would assume that some people found this story incredulous and went to go check the bridge to go see the proof for themselves. But the better part of the people, when they heard this story for themselves, were also astonished that this ox was able to pull off such an amazing feat of strength. And everyone, including the Kawachi no Zenji when the story eventually made its way to him, to whom the ox actually belonged to, praised it to high heaven. Not only that, but when the Zenji's friend returned the ox, the Zenji then ordered the caretakers to give this astounding animal the best and the finest care that any ox had ever received. In his eyes, this ox had earned itself a great reward by pulling off such an amazing feat of strength. And so, while being bummed that his friend had lost a carriage, that's unfortunate, the Kawachi no Zenji was nonetheless very pleased to learn that he had the fortune of owning one of the most impressive oxen ever born, and just left it at that. But not long after this whole incident, the text doesn't specify how long exactly, but I imagine it was something like a day later, the ox disappeared. Again, the text doesn't explain what exactly happened, but I imagine one of the caretakers one day went in wherever they were keeping it, fully intending to lavish this animal with all of the luxuries it had earned, and it was gone. Just nothing. Then, running to the Kawachi no Zenji in a near panic, he explained that the ox was nowhere to be seen. The Zenji then himself sprang into action and went to go see for himself, and when he arrived at where they typically kept it, sure enough, it was gone. Thinking it must have gotten out somehow, he ordered some of the servants to go look for it out on the property. And when that turned up nothing, he sent them out to look in the surrounding area, like in the neighborhood. It couldn't have gotten far. It was an ox, okay? Someone just probably forgot to lock a door or something, and it was grazing in some random patch of grass. Cattle don't typically run away from places with security and a steady supply of food. But after some time of searching around the neighborhood, the servants all came back with the news that the ox was nowhere to be seen. The Zenji, of course, was really bummed out by this news. To put it into perspective, imagine that you woke up one day to find your car missing, which would already be quite the tragedy considering how much those things cost and how most people need them to do anything. I mean, they're extremely valuable items. Except also imagine that your car was a living thing and something that you had relied on for years that also turned out to be one of the best cars anyone had ever had, and then suddenly just one day, poof, gone. Yeah, that would be a massive blow to just about anyone. But honestly, as depressing as it was, what was the Zenji gonna do about it? He had no explanation for how it disappeared in the first place. He couldn't imagine how it had gotten out at all. Everything seemed normal, even if it was an incredibly strong ox and maybe even capable of breaking down walls or fences that were used to corral it. There was no sign of damage anywhere. And again, even if it had broken out, it's not like it had a reason to go running off somewhere far beyond the area surrounding the estate. It was almost like someone had just come in and led it away. But that was impossible. You can't just steal an ox and then not get noticed. It's a freaking ox. It's not like you could just slip it into the sleeve of your billowy robes and steal away from the property. That night, the Kawachi no Zenji went to sleep in a very bad mood. He had gone from being overjoyed about finding out how special this ox was to being completely bummed that it was gone. But again, what could he do? Luckily, his crestfallen mood didn't keep him from falling asleep that night, and he soon found himself sound asleep. But as it turned out, this night's sleep wasn't going to remain undisturbed because the Kawachi no Zenji had a dream. In this dream, he saw his relative, the Sadaiben, who, if you remember from the beginning of the story, had drowned on his way to the province of Awa. The Zenji, despite being in a dream, recognized that the man before him had died, and he was lucid enough to feel a knot of fear form in his gut as he wondered to himself why the Sadaiben, whose lifeless body was trapped under the waves of the sea, was now standing before him. The dead Sadaiben then turned to the Zenji and told him, "After I died, my spirit came to haunt the northwest part of this property. But as punishment for my sins in life, once a day, I go to Hizume Bridge and receive whatever suffering is in store for me that day. And because my sins weigh so heavily on my soul, there is no beast of burden that can carry my weight, and I am forced to haul myself there by my own feet. Having to heave my weight to go anywhere is pure torture. But I've noticed that your ox is particularly strong, and I have, therefore, borrowed it. But since you have been searching for it so eagerly, I am here to tell you that I shall return it to you in 6 days at the hour of the snake. There is no need to continue searching for it so desperately anymore." At the Sadaifu's final word, the Kawachi no Zenji woke up. He laid there for a moment trying to process both his fear at seeing a dead man show up in his dream and what he had been told. Now clearly this had been a dream, but it had been so vivid and had been actually about something pertinent in the real world. Maybe it was, in a sense, real. But then maybe it was just a dream. Regardless, it was very strange and the Zenji wasn't sure exactly what to make of it. He told some of the people in his orbit what he had seen, but they too were just as perplexed as he was. Again, it could very well have meant something deeper, but then again, maybe not. I mean, who can really tell? Sometimes you just have vivid dreams and sometimes they just make sense. I mean, he was worried about his ox, so maybe that's why he was dreaming about somebody telling him that his ox was going to come back. But, as you have probably guessed, 6 days after the Zenji had this dream, around the hour of the snake, someone saw the ox wandering around the property. Where it had come from, no one could say. It came just like it went, just inexplicably. And the real kicker, though, was that it looked like the poor thing had been through the ringer and was absolutely exhausted. However, it was back, safe and sound where it belonged. And the Zenji held to his previous declaration and saw to it that it was given the best care that he could afford. He was a bit concerned about where it had been and why it looked like it had been to hell and back, but it was back, and in one piece, and that was all that really mattered. Naturally, the story that the people started telling each other was that the dead Sadaifu had seen this ox's feat of incredible strength while he was suffering under the burden of his sins at Hizume Bridge, and there he realized that this ox could very likely bear his weight and provide at least a bit of relief from the torment he suffered beyond the grave. And that is why the ox had not only disappeared, but reappeared looking like it was ready to keel over at any moment. It had been carrying the incredible weight of a spirit burdened by some very, very heavy sins. What those sins are, we can only speculate. And then the writer of the story ends by saying that he heard the story from the mouth of the Kawachi no Zenji himself. And thus is it said that this was a very frightening story indeed. Which is something I don't really agree with. I mean, the Zenji was already no stranger to people borrowing his ox, and nothing really happened, so what was there really to be afraid of? I mean, he did see a dead man in his dream, but like, is that really the scariest thing you can think of? I suppose maybe the scary part is clearly that wasn't just a dream, that was actually a spirit trying to communicate with the living. But again, like, my guy wasn't trying to like attack you or anything. He was just saying, hey man, I'm borrowing your cow. Thanks, I'll bring it back. But that is actually where I'm going to end this story. So, if you did enjoy that, you found it entertaining, please don't forget to like the video and please subscribe to the channel because there are still plenty more stories where this one came from. And if you have been watching all the way up to the end here, I do thank you sincerely. Ito, ureshiu koso haberikere. And hopefully we will see you next week for a new story about a woman, a very high-class woman, one of the most important people in Japanese society, hanging out at home when she hears something really, really disconcerting. However, I'm also going to say that technically the next story in this collection is it's not really a short one, but there's not actually a whole lot that happens in it. There's a lot of superfluous details that most of us wouldn't really care about. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that into a short, if I can, and I'll release that alongside, or maybe even possibly a few days before, I normally release the next video after this one. Which again, that one, the proper video is going to be about a very high class, one of the, I don't know if she actually became an empress or if she was just a consort to one of the emperors, but one of the most important women in Japanese history, Japanese society at the time, who's hanging out at home and hears something that kind of disturbs her. And yet it's kind of cool. It's really cool, actually. Anyway, that is where I'm going to end it. Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you later. Goodbye.